Compost is one of the most important garden soil amendments. But what happens when your compost was supposed to look like this and ends up looking like this? Is this even okay to use? Well, the answer is yes, but only if used in the right way. Because if I was to start my seeds in this, my seedlings would struggle before even getting into the ground. This compost would make an excellent aerated compost tea, but isn't going to supply much in the way of nutrients to my soil. And that's why compost can be confusing, because not all compost works the same way. So in this video, I'm going to show you the 4 types of compost that I use in my garden, and more importantly, how to make them so that you can stop wasting materials and start making better compost to boost your garden. And the best part is, if you learn how to make just one of these composts, you can make all of the others. And so that's where we're going to start. And by the way, I'm Taylor. I help gardeners explore low-cost, sustainable, and regenerative growing techniques, and compost really sits at the forefront of a lot of that. But without defining compost, it'll be hard to understand much about what we're talking about. And so, to put it as simply as possible, compost is decomposed organic matter that is made with the intention of fertilizing our plants. And at a certain level, that's where we could leave it. But leaving it there also leaves a huge opening for interpretation. So I'm actually going to define compost a little more specifically and say that compost is 2 or more types of organic matter, which just means that anything that was once alive mixed together and decomposed. So essentially, for the rest of the video, we'll be walking through how to do that. And along the way, we'll be making tweaks here and there to result in slightly different finished products. To start, let's take a look at the compost that every gardener should learn how to make at some point: hot compost. We'll get into why you want to do this a little bit later on, but it kind of helps to see what's actually happening here. There are 4 components to making hot compost: volume, aeration, moisture, and ingredients. And if you'd like a printable reference sheet for this, you can download our free hot compost PDF linked in the description, or scan the code on the screen. But it really helps to be able to see this to understand how these work together. When I say volume, I'm talking about the amount of organic matter, because we need to have a good amount to be able to achieve hot compost temperatures. Typically, a 3-foot tall pile with roughly 3 feet in diameter or width is going to do the trick. You can also make it larger by extending the pile in one direction. But for this pile, it's best if you can keep it at a max of 3 feet, either in height or width. And the reason for that is that when it comes to keeping the pile aerated, this is the second component of a hot compost pile. The microorganisms on the ingredients in the pile need proper access to oxygen if they're going to survive. And with a pile that's 3 feet across one way, oxygen is going to be able to reach the center of the pile effectively. Generally speaking, a pile that's not too damp is going to allow airflow 1.5 feet deep. Of course, there's nuance to that, but since we're touching on moisture content, I'll say that the microorganisms need oxygen and water to survive. So we need our materials to be damp, but not sopping wet. And this is one of those things that's hard to describe exactly. A lot of people often say, like a well-wrung sponge, it's damp, but not exactly dripping water. And the main thing is that if your materials are too wet, they'll lose access to oxygen. And that's going to slow down decomposition, resulting in a less helpful finished product. The 4th component of hot compost are your ingredients. And whereas this is a very basic and often limited view on ingredients, we most often talk about them in 2 categories: nitrogen-rich materials, or greens, and carbon-rich materials, or browns. And ratios can get confusing, and everyone sort of has a different take on how this works best. Generally, I think that it's safe to say that you're looking for an equal amount of nitrogen and carbon. We're starting basic here so we can build things and tweak from here on out. But let me show you a few of the ingredients that actually went into this pile. On the nitrogen-rich side, I used chicken manure. On the carbon-rich side, I used dried leaves, straw, and wood chips. And I'll say now that I also added some optional secret ingredients to this pile, but you're gonna have to wait until later on in the video to find out exactly what those were, so hang on tight for that. Chicken manure, dried leaves, straw, and wood chips will get you this pile to heat up, no problem, just as long as you have enough. Now, it's winter when I made this, so those are the main ingredients that I have access to right now. But during the growing season, you can use grass clippings, crop residue, even weeds as nitrogen sources. Of course, you can also use other animal manures if you have access to them. You can toss in fruit and veggie scraps, coffee grounds. All of those things are great nitrogen sources. So on the carbon-rich side, though, you can use wood chips or wood shavings. You can use dried grass, shredded paper, cardboard. And just wetting down those materials, piling them up, giving it a bit of time, results in a rise in temperature. One small note here too is that if you're able to shred up your materials a bit, that's going to increase their surface area, allowing the microorganisms more access to the points to feed on and result in a faster rise in temp. And that's because heat is generated by the microbes in the pile that come preloaded on the materials you use, who feed on nitrogen and carbon and generate heat all on their own. And there is a temperature range that we're looking for here that's between 130 degrees Fahrenheit and 160 or 55 to 70 Celsius. And the reason that we're shooting for that range is because once we start getting up past 130, we start killing off weed seeds, and a particular set of microorganisms can get really established and locked in. Those are our thermophilic bacteria, and they're gonna really help us to decompose materials quickly. And one quick thing here, if you can wait for compost, you can always just add these ingredients or other ingredients as you get them and make the same compost only a little bit more slowly. And we'll touch on cold compost in a sec, but just wanted to say hot compost is not the end goal. Good quality compost is the end goal. And sometimes you can actually get a bit better of a finished product without the heat. But I still like doing the hot compost method for the sake of speed and a few other reasons. We'll touch on why you might not want to generate this much heat in another part of the video. But for this particular pile, we're trying to break down the organic matter so that it roughly resembles soil as fast as possible. And the way that we do that is by utilizing thermophilic bacteria while they're at peak activity, because they're on a bit of a timer. Once your pile heats up to that thermophilic range, the nitrogen starts getting spent. And once the microbes run out of nitrogen, they're gonna start cooling down their activity. So the pile is gonna come up past 130, and the only thing you need to watch for is that the pile doesn't pass 160 too much, because that is the temperature range where the thermophilic bacteria start dying off. But that shouldn't be a problem if you've balanced the pile correctly. The main thing that we're looking for is when the pile starts decreasing in temperature, because once temps start dropping, it means that we need to give it a mix and assess how things are going. People often refer to this process as flipping the pile or turning it. Essentially what we're doing here is we're taking the top of the pile and we're making it the bottom of the pile. And then we're inverting the edges so that the outside of the pile becomes the inside and vice versa. And doing this makes a couple things happen. One, we're reintroducing oxygen into the pile, we're aerating it. Two, we're also able to take stock of the moisture content of the inside of the pile. Could be that things are just right, damp, not sopping wet. Could be that things are drying out a bit. This is usually a problem for me in the summer months. Hard to keep things fully damp when it's 1,000,000 degrees out and 0% humidity. On the other hand, in mixing up the materials, you might notice that things are too wet. Maybe you accidentally oversaturated the pile when you first made it, and now it's clumpy and stinky. You know things are too wet if they smell putrid or foul or strong like ammonia, and if that's the case, you can try spreading out the materials, cover it up with a tarp, let it dry out a bit before restacking it. It's also possible that you've got a bit too much nitrogen in there, which can cause things to get sludgy, since nitrogen-rich materials bring more water to the equation. And in that case, you could balance it out with some more carbon-rich materials. And the third reason that you're gonna flip your pile, though, is just to bathe all the materials in the warmth of the microbial activity and to fully inoculate everything. If you've got weed seeds hanging out in the outer edges of the pile, and you never mix those into the center where the majority of the heat is coming from, they're gonna survive, and they're gonna stay in your compost once it's finished. And by the way, I almost always have weed seeds in my finished compost at some level, so don't be too ashamed if you do too. Once you flip the pile, it's gonna heat back up and then drop again. And once it starts dropping in temp, that's your cue to flip again. Eventually, this usually happens after the third flip. The pile is going to have spent its nitrogen, and you're gonna be left with a soil-like material full of stable organic nitrogen, and it's ready to be used in a number of ways. But let's say you forgot to monitor your compost pile, or you just lost interest and never flipped it after the initial heat up, because let's be honest, sometimes that happens. And in fact, it happened to me recently. We were in the middle of a move and I made some compost while staying in my in-laws' house. Strange thing to make at a time like that, I know, but I'm a compulsive compost maker. Point is, I forgot to flip it and it cooled down and lost a bit of its thermophilic activity. So let's go ahead and take a look at how it's doing. So here's the pile, it's covered up with a tarp. And I didn't say it before, but for any compost that you're making, you want to keep it covered with something. And the reason for that is because you want to limit the evaporation if it's sunny, or oversaturation if it's rainy. And contrary to what people say, water will not leach out nutrients from the pile. The real concern is just managing the moisture levels. So let's take a look. So this pile was made from chicken bedding, largely as kind of the base. Again, so we have these leaves and straw and some wood shavings in there as well. And then chicken manure, mix some bokashi stuff in here, some Korean natural farming inputs. Something that I notice is that I've got these little kernels sprouting, and this is from the straw in the chicken bedding. Straw sometimes just comes with little weeds, and then there's like some tiny little weeds in here as well. I also used some yarrow as kind of some of the green material. So one of the main things that we look for when we're picking apart these piles is, or just looking at the pile, is, are individual materials recognizable? So, you know, the straw is pretty recognizable. It takes a while to break down. And then we've got some leaves in here as well. But this has honestly done a great job at decomposing. We could sift this and get something really good out of it. The main thing that might be a little bit problematic would be just these weed seeds that are germinating. Thing is, keeping it covered is going to help with that, obviously. Something else that you'll notice, and this is true of every compost that I've ever made, I would say, I'm trying to think if there's exceptions, is that compost that you make, and this is just something you should be aware of, compost that you make is going to be a lot browner than black. And we'll touch on this in a little bit, but the industrial sized composting operations, they pump out compost that oftentimes looks black. And there's this idea that like you can get like black gold or something, soil. But a lot of, I would say most like high quality compost and homemade compost for sure is going to be more brown than black. Something else to do, I guess just smelling it, is there's no off odors. It just smells like fresh compost. So I'm gonna go ahead and cover this back up. So if you did this with your compost pile, you set it and forgot it, and now it's cold, you are gonna be just fine. And there's a few things that you could do. You could add more nitrogen to the pile. If it feels a bit dry, you could water it down a bit more to get the materials properly saturated. For this pile though, I'm actually gonna just leave it. And I'm doing this because there's still almost 4 months before my in-laws' beautiful perennial garden springs back to life. And whereas it's nice to get compost on the soil as soon as possible, it's also totally fine to just let it rot away slowly altogether. Because one of the things that you're doing with compost making in general is you're creating a balanced material. This compost is going to let all the microorganisms develop slowly, and the cultures are going to mature. The nutrients are really going to continue to stabilize. There's going to be a good chance that worms are going to naturally find their way into this pile and start processing the materials a bit more. So we're going to let it rock for a bit longer. Now again, if you had something like this and you wanted to spread it on your garden now, it would be totally fine. Only thing that you might want to watch out for here is if you had a ton of weed seeds in there. And in that case, depending on how many, you might just want to leave it covered for a while, even into the summer a little bit, to let those weed seeds grow and look for sunlight, not find it, expend their energy, and then eventually die off. But for now, let's go ahead and take a look at finished compost from a previous hot compost batch that I made. Now, compost making is an art, and it's also a long game sort of thing. And so this compost is some stuff that I made a long time ago, probably close to 7 months by now. It was actually some of the compost that I made at our old house, and I bagged it up and took it with us so that we would have something to use here on the farm. And I'll show you how I'm using this stuff specifically, but just to take a look at the material here, this is compost that is heated up to that thermophilic temperature range, cooled, flipped, added water, reheated, cooled, flipped, reheated. And then once it cooled for its final time, it aged for 7 months. And one of the keys to compost aging well is proper moisture management, as I mentioned before. And that means that it's not too wet and it's not too dry. You will be able to tell by the feel and by the smell if it's too wet. If it's slimy and smells putrid, like bad breath or poopy, it means that anaerobes have taken hold and are slowing decomposition. Now, if that is the case for your compost, there's no need to fret. It's absolutely something that you can recover from simply, as you may have guessed, by just drying it out a little bit. You can spread it out, you can mix it up, you could even add in some more carbon-rich materials to help soak up some of that excess moisture. And once it balances out a bit, the aerobic microorganisms are going to re-enter the scene and the materials are going to restart their decomposition journey. The only thing that you want to keep in mind is that if you are putting in undecomposed carbon materials, those are going to be starting from a different place in their journey of decomposition than the carbon materials from the original pile. And that might have felt a little bit too confusing, so don't worry about it too much. Point is, this compost here is what I like to call finished compost, and it can be used in the garden in a few ways. How we use it is going to be determined by what we need it for. And the main thing that I need this for right now is for our seed starting mix. So we use compost in our potting soil recipe, and we also use a mini soil blocker to start most of our seeds right now, which means that this compost is not fine textured enough. I could wait another year and it probably would be totally fine to use, but I need it now, so I'm gonna sift it. And these are my compost sifters, and I've got one that uses a 1/2 inch hardware cloth screen, and then this one uses a 1/4 inch. I made this one so that it would fit on top of a 27-gallon tote, so I just pile my compost on top and start shaking it back and forth, and before long I've got my first screening done. This is what the 1/2 inch hardware cloth produces. It's a really nice texture. This stuff is totally usable for a medium soil blocker and certainly usable in pots or raised beds. But if I try to get my mini soil blocker in there, it can't really pick up the bigger chunks as well, and it results in a clumpy mini soil block. So I screen this stuff through my 1/4 inch sifter, and I made this so that it would just sit right on top of the 1/2 inch hardware cloth sifter. I sift a lot of compost because we make all of our own potting mix, but it's possible that you don't need to sift a ton, in which case you could totally use one of these instead. We use this one for years, and I highly recommend it if you're only sifting a smaller amount. And when I sift through the 1/4 inch hardware cloth screen, it gives me this stuff. And this is just like really nice textured, fine sifted compost. You can see that the mini soil blocker has no difficulty scooping it up and forming a nice uniform block. It basically looks indistinguishable from really nice quality garden soil. One more quick note on sifting. There's sort of a catch-22 here when it comes to efficient sifting, especially when you're sifting by hand. If you've got damp materials like this, they're going to sift quite a bit slower than dry materials. And you can see with this stuff, which is a different type of compost that we'll touch on a little bit later, this is pretty dry material and it falls through the hardware cloth without me hardly even having to try to do anything by comparison. So if you're ready to sift compost, something you might consider, if you're able, is actually drying it out a little bit so that it sifts easier. Contrary to what I've heard from a number of people on the internet, a lack of moisture does not mean that all the microbes die. Some of them will, the more sensitive ones, but many just go dormant and then reawaken once they get rehydrated. And this will become relevant a little bit later on, so I'll wait to further explain until then. That's where this whole process that we started right at the beginning with our hot compost pile ends, in this beautiful growing medium in which our seeds can germinate and grow until they're ready to be planted into the field. And we add other ingredients for our potting mix too, which is for a different video. This stuff falls into the category of a nutritional compost. It's well balanced, it's fine textured, it contains a broad spectrum of nutrients that are essential for plant growth, and it contains a decent amount of microbial activity. Most homemade composts are going to fall into this category because everything you have on hand to make compost is likely a pretty nutritionally dense material. But what you might be wondering about is what we do with the compost that gets sifted and tossed out. Well, let me tell you, we certainly don't throw that stuff away. There are several ways that we can and will use it, and the first way is going to bring us to our second category of compost, mulching composts. Now, I've often referred to these compost categories on this channel as the 4 types of compost that you need to know about, and I got this from Jesse Frost's book, The Living Soil Handbook. Highly recommend you check it out. We just talked through an example of a nutritional compost. We'll get into fertilizing and inoculating composts in a minute, but this next category of mulching composts is one of the places that we use our sifted bits. And the reason for that is because an ideal mulch serves a couple functions of the garden. First of all, it stops water from being evaporated quite so quickly off of the soil surface, which protects soil microbes, reduces soil compaction, helps you water less, obviously. But the second thing that an ideal mulch does is that it feeds soil biology. So when you put organic matter on the soil, such as these chunky bits of compost, microorganisms in the soil are going to join the dinner party, so to speak. There's already microbes covering these materials that are actively decomposing them, but now we are getting the soil biology in on the action. And the microbes found on the compost are going to cross-pollinate with the soil microbes. They're going to carry organic matter and nutrients down into the soil where they can be delivered to plant roots, all while the bulky materials keep the sun from zapping the soil surface. And what's really nice about using this kind of compost as a mulching compost is that it takes a while for the materials to decompose, meaning you're passively feeding soil biology while also not needing to replenish your mulch quite as quickly. And there are a couple other types of compost that we use as mulches. Anything that you buy in bulk from a municipal composting center is most likely going to be viable as a mulching compost. And this is pretty important to understand. A lot of compost that you buy either in bulk or bagged from a Home Depot or the plant nursery is going to fall into this category. Not all. There are certainly plenty of high quality nutritional composts out there, but most of them are going to best serve the function of a mulch. And that means that you might be able to plant your seeds and seedlings directly into them, but more than likely, you're also going to need to add some fertilizer, preferably organic, or what I prefer, some beneficial microorganisms. And we'll get into this when we hit on inoculating composts. The goal for these large compost making operations is to churn through the yard waste that they get from homeowners and landscaping companies as quickly as possible so they can get their finished product of sellable compost. And so a lot of the same ingredients that you might use in your home compost pile are going to go into their piles, but the difference is that their main goal in getting their windrows to heat up is not to lock in the beneficial biology that's going to lock in the nutrients. It's actually to make certain that they kill off weed seeds and pathogens with scorching high temperatures, and so that the materials get mechanically broken down faster. So the finished product by design doesn't contain a whole lot in the way of microorganisms. A lot of the temperatures that these facilities are bringing their piles to are too hot for even the thermophilic microbes to survive. So what you'll get is likely going to have some noticeable woody or chunky bits. Nothing wrong with that. I've also found pieces of plastic and even a few glass shards here and there. And I have had some challenging experiences in the past trying to work with bulk compost and coming to realize that it just doesn't quite offer everything that you need when it comes to really building your soil or restoring it. So keep that in mind. You might have better access to a high quality product. If so, by all means, use that. And it's also worth saying that if you don't want to sift your homemade compost, and you just want to leave in the more decomposed bits with the bulky parts, you can totally use that as a mulching compost too. What I do though, if that's what I'm going for, is that I deliberately skew the initial compost pile ingredients a little bit more carbon rich. And usually for me, that means that I add in more wood chips to do that. Reason being, wood chips take a long time to decompose. Again, what you're looking for in a mulching compost. People get worried about robbing their soil of nitrogen with wood chips, but again, this is a mulch, which means that it's sitting on top of the soil surface, far away from the precious nitrogen in the lower layers of the soil where your plant will be feeding. If you were to mix in a bulky compost like this into your soil, then you'd be effectively starting a new compost pile that really skewed carbon rich, and the nitrogen would get used up and locked up, so don't do that. But there is an area of our garden where, believe it or not, we are trying to soak up nitrogen, and for that we have to say hello to our dinosaurs. Chickens are one of the most incredible compost makers accessible to gardeners. Two of the things that we did by hand to get our compost pile ready, these gals are doing for us. Number one, they're shredding up carbon-rich materials, and number two, they're adding nitrogen to the equation. And you already saw these ingredients as part of the compost pile that we made earlier. But this stuff on its own, without heating up a giant pile, can be used as a mulching compost. And I want to touch on exactly what is happening here in my coop and pen. This is going to be old news to many of you, but this system is sometimes called the deep litter method, and it's often used to describe a way to keep chicken coops from smelling bad. And the reason for that is because when these chickens start dropping bombs, those fresh turds are gonna do a few things. First, and I know we're getting a little bit technical here, but the droppings full of urea, which is a form of nitrogen, are gonna quickly hydrolyze and convert into ammonium. And that's because chickens don't poop out pebbles, they're wet. And sorry to gross anyone out, but chickens poop and pee at the same time. It's all just in one package delivery, and that water reacts with the urea in the package, which causes a chemical reaction called hydrolysis, and the urea is processed into ammonium, which then it off-gasses as ammonia. And I know that's a bit technical for describing what happens when a chicken poops, but it can really help us understand and harness the nitrogen with the deep litter method. Instead of off-gassing right away, if a chicken poops on dry carbon-rich material like leaves or straw or wood chips, the moisture gets absorbed and the ammonia is adsorbed onto the carbon surfaces. And this helps balance out the carbon to nitrogen ratio, slows down microbial activity, and it stops those volatile gases from fumigating the coop. If you smell an abundance of eye-burning, throat-swelling ammonia in your coop, your chickens are also probably suffering and could do with some new bedding. But the good news is that that material, the chicken manure straw leaf combo, is a great compost material, as you just observed. Now, you can buy chicken manure from the store, and those are usually just containing straight up manure, no bedding added. If you collect pure chicken turds, same thing, and this can be considered compost, but it comes with a warning label, which is just be careful and don't overdo it. Because of that large amount of water-soluble nitrogen, chicken manure is a bit closer to being fertilizer than compost. It's actually what Farmer Jesse calls a fertilizing compost. And there are different types of fertilizing composts, many of which come from animal manure, but some are just composts that have been loaded up with blood meal or other organic fertilizers. And the reason that you need to be careful with these is because the nitrogen can burn your plants. I don't think I've really ever just applied a straight up fertilizing compost to any of our garden beds. I always add other stuff into the mix or let it age on the soil surface. It's winter as we're making this video, so we could, with reasonable safety, spread chicken manure straight up on our garden beds and let it decompose and integrate into the soil over the next few months as we await the growing season. Just make sure that you don't apply this to soil with plants in the ground or shortly before planting. Now, there is another type of fertilizing compost that I can recommend if you have it, and these are your cold manures. And there's sort of a spectrum here. On the hot end, you've got manure from chickens, pigs, horses, and such. And then the manures start to cool down as you get into sheep and goat manure, which means that the amount of water-soluble nitrogen starts going down and the insoluble forms of nitrogen are more present. And then animals like alpacas and rabbits actually poop out stuff that a lot of people claim to use directly on their garden beds as a sort of slow release nitrogen fertilizing compost, since it contains a larger amount of organic or insoluble nitrogen. I actually got some bags of rabbit manure from someone who's selling them on Facebook Marketplace for super cheap, and I'm using these in several ways. I'm composting them, I'm using them in some of my hugelkultur beds, and I'm running some experiments with IMO5, which we'll touch on in a moment. In summary, be careful with fertilizing composts, aka nitrogen-rich manure. Actually mixing it with other materials like dried leaves and wood chips and straw will help convert the inorganic nitrogen into organic forms, which is good because inorganic or water-soluble nitrogen can be lost to leaching, whereas organic nitrogen sticks around and feeds soil biology slowly over time. And it's really worth understanding this, so I just want to briefly go over how a finished mature compost actually fertilizes your garden, because it's not a fertilizer in the same way that a pelletized Miracle-Gro fertilizer works. Synthetic fertilizers are adding raw nutrients, largely nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that are immediately available for plants to uptake, which may seem like a good thing, and in fact it can be really effective initially in growing plants. But when we use those things, we're bypassing a whole swath of natural processes that are going to leave our plants vulnerable, specifically because they won't have the supportive biology in the soil. And that soil biology has many jobs, but one of its roles in the garden is to unlock nutrients from organic matter, like your compost, and make it available to plants in the raw form. So compost has nitrogen in it, but it's in a stable form. It's what we call insoluble organic, which allows it to stay in the soil without washing away, and it gives the microbes food and encourages them to deliver the nutrients to plant roots. So let's recap a bit of what we've covered. We've talked through how to make a hot compost. This results in a well-balanced, nutrient-dense finished compost fairly fast, which can then be used in a few ways. You can also go the cold compost route, which usually takes a little bit longer, but actually might yield a bit more nutrient-dense material. You can sift out the chunks and use those as a mulch. You can use the fine textured material in potting mix, or you can just throw all of it under your garden beds. You can use chicken manure straight up in small amounts as a fertilizing compost, or you can use a colder manure such as rabbit droppings freely as a stable form of fertility. So far, all of these composts serve the function of providing nutrients to the plants and the soil biology. And they also help with the soil texture as they integrate with the topsoil in your garden beds. And this organic matter also helps lock in and manage moisture in the garden. But there's one last category of compost. And I think that this one is the least understood and least appreciated types: inoculating compost. Now, inoculate is a big word. It's sort of another way of saying infect. So if I give someone my cold, I've infected them with the virus. The main difference is that inoculation is an intentional act. We're deliberately introducing a microorganism, hopefully a beneficial one, or a set of beneficial microorganisms into another entity. And so when we think about our inoculating composts, the way we get there is by introducing additional microorganisms to them. Now to start, I want to reveal my first secret ingredient for the hot compost pile that I showed you earlier, and you've actually already seen it. It's the chunky compost that I sifted out of my finished compost. These bits are covered in beneficial biology, and when I incorporated them into my hot compost pile, I inoculated that pile with microbes from a previous batch. And the technical term for this is actually backslopping. Backslopping is the traditional wine and cheese making term where they save a portion of their last batch to inoculate the next one with the same cultures. And that inoculation just kickstarts the microbial journey. It's not necessary for making hot compost, just an extra step you can take if you've got some left over. And it shows us a bit about how inoculation works. With microorganisms, because their genetics are pretty simple, they're able to multiply very quickly. Some estimates say that bacteria double every few hours to as little as 20 minutes in ideal conditions. So even adding a few handfuls of compost to a new pile is going to multiply microbes exponentially. Another type of inoculation that we can look at is one that we've already touched on, worms. Worms are a pretty common garden pet for good reason. If you probably already know, worm castings, otherwise known as vermicompost, is thought to be a really useful type of compost for gardeners. But the key is in how it's used. Worms are able to process organic matter relatively quickly into a pretty fine textured substance. And what happens here is that the worms are actually largely feeding on bacteria in the media they're living in. They also feed on the materials themselves and the fruit and veggie scraps, but largely they're feeding on bacteria, which are decomposing the plant debris. And the environment of a worm bin, or just wherever the worms are feeding, becomes very rich in bacteria, making it a great inoculating compost. So how do we use it? Well, we don't want to use this stuff as a mulch because the value is largely in the bacteria and the texture. So a great use of worm castings is actually as an addition to potting mix. The texture is already really fine. The bacteria cultures are going to help facilitate plant growth and keep the environment microbially strong, and the castings will also contain a bit of nutrients for your plants. Another great use is to just spread them out on the soil and cover them with a mulch in your veggie beds or garden beds where you're growing. More on the annuals side. Annual veggies and flowers benefit a lot from healthy bacteria since they're fast growing and don't need to necessarily tap into the fungal cultures to thrive, although that does help too. But the main thing when you're supplying annuals with worm castings, as I mentioned, is that you need to cover them with a mulch. No need to mix them into the soil because the microorganisms are going to get washed down into the soil as you water or as it rains. Now, if you want to use this microbe-rich compost another way, you can also make an aerated worm casting tea out of it by just adding a handful of the castings to a paint strainer or whatever you've got and steeping it in dechlorinated water while continuously aerating it with a bubbler like this. Then you want to add some molasses, just a little bit is fine, and then that's going to feed the bacteria a little bit more and help them multiply even further. So in this environment, we're taking our bacteria found in our worm castings and we're expanding them by feeding them carbohydrates in water while keeping the water aerated with the bubbler. And that way the aerobic bacteria survive and the anaerobic bacteria don't take hold. The reason that we want the aerobic bacteria is because when we go to spray this on our plant foliage, we want the right kind of bacteria on the plant. We want them to be able to survive so that they can protect the plant from disease and aid the plant in all the other functions that it's trying to perform as it grows strong and healthy. So what I like to do for my worm bedding is actually just take some of my unsifted finished compost and I use that. And then of course I make sure that it's damp enough and feed the worms food scraps. But this kind of compost will actually feed worms all on its own for a while, I've noticed. If you use bedding like peat moss or cocoa coir, those are neutral carbon materials that don't come preloaded with the biology that compost has. And since worms need microbes in their diet, you have to feed the bin food scraps if you use those neutral media. But let's say that you don't want to bother with worms. Let's take a look at another inoculant. Leaf mold. Now, leaf mold is what you got when dried leaves decompose so much that they basically look like soil. Here I've got some leaf mold that is about a year old. I actually sifted this twice to get it this fine. But the texture is incredible. It feels so nice to run through your fingers. And leaf mold is not something that I consider a compost since it's just one ingredient. But let's look briefly at what this stuff is good for. Leaves are a carbon-rich substance that break down slowly over time as fungi and actinomycetes digest and decompose the lignin. This results in a very microbially rich substance that also has an enormous amount of water carrying capacity. That's the power of microbes. That's why we want microbes in our soil, because they're decomposing organic matter and creating tilth, structure, and increasing water carrying capacity. So you can imagine the beneficial impact that leaf mold has on your soil. In fact, this is the stuff that forest soil is made from. Years, centuries of trees dropping leaves, decomposing on the forest floor, turning into humus, feeding the soil biology. It would follow that the biology in that soil is extremely robust, and that's where Jadon microbial solution comes in. When we borrow some of the soil found underneath the leaf litter in the forest, we're capturing some of the best microorganisms available to our unique climate. And we can use that in and of itself as an inoculant for our compost pile, but I like to use this soil as an inoculum for a tea similar to the worm casting tea that we talked about earlier, except Jadon microbial solution, if you made this before, you know it doesn't use a bubbler. The microorganisms keep themselves aerated. We feed them potato or cooked grains instead of molasses, and we add a pinch of sea salt, and then once the bubbles have fully formed the disc on the surface of the water, we can use it. And typically I use this to water into my soil or on my plants, but if we're making an inoculating compost, we can also just pour this stuff on our cooled down compost pile and get it saturated with the beneficial forest microbes. And so now we've got an easy inoculating compost. Thing is here is that we want to make sure that the pile is decreased in temp before adding the microbial solution so that we don't kill off the beneficial biology, because these microbes fall into the mesophilic category as opposed to the thermophilic. They prefer and really need mild temperatures that cap out at 120 degrees Fahrenheit and get killed off much past that. Now that's about as easy as it gets, in my opinion. No reason not to inoculate your compost with Jadon microbial solution. But if you want to make a truly powerful inoculating compost, you can do so by making something called Indigenous Microorganisms Stage 5, or just IMO 5. And to make this, I'm going to be combining my IMO 4 with rabbit manure that I showed you guys earlier. And for this, I'm basically making a very, very short compost pile, trying to mix up the IMO 4 inoculant with the rabbit manure and wetting it down with some of what I call IMO water. This is stuff that contains some additional homemade liquid gardening inputs, some OHN, FPJ, vinegar, sea salt water, and humic acid. And these are microbial curators. If you would like a more in-depth explanation of this process, you can check out our complete guide to IMO video. But the really interesting thing about this pile is that, short as it is, because the microbes are so strong, it's actually going to generate a good amount of heat. And this is both a good thing and something to watch out for, because like I mentioned before, these are mesophilic forest microbes, meaning that they can die off if the temps rise too high. We're looking at that 110 to 120 range for IMO 5. And so when making this, you need to spread it out if it's getting too hot, let it cool down a bit, and then repile it just so that it can continue culturing. Just like our hot compost piles, these IMO 5 piles will heat up and cool down all on their own. And once it's cooled down, it can be stored until it's ready to be used in a tea similar to the worm casting tea, or just spread out thinly across the garden. And in case I didn't say it clearly enough before, inoculating composts are composts that are used in smaller amounts. No one's going to be filling a whole raised bed with worm castings. You don't need to go planting directly into your IMO 5. These composts are used in small doses, just enough that the microbiology works its way into your soil and starts inoculating the garden. And that said, instead of using large amounts all at once, it's typically best to use them little by little as the growing season progresses and as growing seasons pass. So applying IMO 5 at the beginning and end of the growing season is great, but also making aerated teas and spraying them onto your plants 2 to 3 times a month is a great way to keep the biology active. Might seem like an extra chore, but if you haven't done this before, I want you to try it out a few times and just make some observations. I think that you'll notice improvements in your garden. If you struggle with disease on your plants, this could be a great way to defend them against that. There are so many things that microorganisms do in the garden, and that's what these inoculating composts help with. Now, as we wrap up, I want to talk about a few more compost-like materials, 2 of which are the extra secret ingredients added to my hot compost pile that we looked at the beginning. A compost that I didn't get to touch on in this video is mushroom compost. And truthfully, I don't know too much about this stuff, but I bring it up because it's a fairly common compost that's sold to home gardeners, and you can make it yourself if you grow mushrooms. Another term for this is spent mushroom substrate, because it's a substance that was used to feed and grow mushrooms that is now largely depleted of nutrients. Not that it's completely depleted, but it won't contain the same nutritional makeup, most likely, as the other compost that we were looking at in this video. it might contain a bit of the mushroom fungal culture if you were the one growing it. But most commercially sold mushroom composts are sterilized before they're sold again. So it sort of reminds me of a peat moss or a coco coir. You can totally use it to improve your soil tilth, basically like really broken down straw, but that is about all I can say on the topic. But for the last two adjacent things that we'll look at, I want to preface by reminding us about the pile that I showed you earlier. Chicken manure, dried leaves, straw, and wood chips. Those ingredients are going to get you compost. Certainly not the only ingredients that will work, but one of the simplest ways to upgrade your compost, any compost you make, is by adding a diversity of ingredients. For example, I could have just gone with chicken manure and dried leaves, or chicken manure and straw, but combining straw, dried leaves, and wood chips, I'm diversifying my ingredients and thereby diversifying the microorganisms that will develop in order to decompose them. Microorganisms rapidly multiply and just as rapidly evolve and adapt. Scientists have been able to see this play out, where microorganisms change their genetic makeup based on the food source that they're given so that they can better digest it. So every new ingredient that you're adding, you're creating a slightly more microbially diverse finished product that eventually leads to a more microbially diverse soil. And one ingredient that I added to this pile, that I add to every compost pile I make at this point, is my bokashi food waste. We won't go into the full bokashi. You can check out our other videos if you'd like to learn how to do this. But essentially, we're fermenting our food waste in advance by using an inoculant to saturate it with biology that begins the decomposition process. And this allows us to compost meat and dairy food waste, cooked foods, everything goes into this pile and serves as a nitrogen source. So not only are we adding a more diverse set of ingredients, we're also inoculating our compost with some additional lactic acid bacteria and that we used to culture the food scraps. Lastly, but crucially, the final compost-like thing that we're going to look at is what is sometimes referred to as a permanent compost. At least I think that's not just my term for it. Charcoal, otherwise known as biochar, once it's been composted, that is. And charcoal is one of the best ingredients for compost. Composting it is the easiest and possibly most effective way at charging and inoculating charcoal, because charcoal, especially activated charcoal, contains a huge amount of internal surface area. So much like our leaf mold that we looked at earlier, charcoal soaks up water and holds onto it really well. But it also adsorbs nutrients and houses microorganisms, and it's super porous structure. We add charcoal to every compost pile that we make because it just gives us a bigger bang for our buck. Wonderful stuff to have in your soil, and composting it just kind of makes sense. For this pile, I actually used probably a 5-gallon bucket's worth, which is right on the upper end. And one last tip here, I like to sprinkle charcoal on the top of each of my piles each time that I repile it, because when your pile heats up, you're going to lose some ammonia to off-gassing. But with the charcoal on top and in the pile, you actually get a chance to recapture a bit of that and store it in the charcoal. Incidentally, charcoal is also a great addition to chicken bedding for the same reason, helps soak up ammonia. Not all of it, but it's useful for reducing odors. So there you go, everyone. Hope that was helpful for you as you are deciding what kind of compost that you're going to be making and where you're using it and how you're getting the most out of it. Make sure to check out the link in the description if you would like your own hot compost guide. And if you liked this video and you haven't done the deep dive into bokashi, you'll want to check out this video next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.